November 2023. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days in Ashmore County, a forgotten corner of rural Pennsylvania where the mountains swallow the sun by 4 in the afternoon and the mist clings to everything like a second skin. The kind of place where neighbors live miles apart, where silence isn't peaceful. It's oppressive. Where the forest seems to breathe. It was on the 3rd day of that relentless rain that the ground finally gave way. The old Hartwell property, or what locals had called it for as long as anyone could remember, sat at the end of a dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance since the 1950s. The road itself seemed reluctant to lead there, winding through dense woods of black oak and pine, narrowing with each turn as if warning travelers to turn back. The house stood alone on 12 acres of overgrown land, surrounded by a rusted iron fence whose gate had long since fallen from its hinges. For a century the house had stood empty, completely, utterly empty. No one had lived there. No one had sold it. No one had even claimed it. And that's what made it impossible. To understand the Hartwell house, you need to understand Ashmore County in 1923. The Great War had ended 5 years prior, but its shadow lingered heavy over America's rural communities. Young men returned home different, hollow-eyed, silent, prone to sudden violence or inexplicable tears. The Spanish flu had swept through just after, taking those who'd survived the trenches. Towns like Ashmore lost a generation in the span of 5 years. But there was something else happening in 1923, something darker. The county had become a way station for rum runners moving illegal alcohol from Canada down through the Appalachian backroads. Money flowed, but so did blood. Shootouts in the woods, bodies found in ravines. Local law enforcement looked the other way when they weren't actively participating. The remoteness that had once protected these communities now made them perfect for those who needed to disappear, or for those who wanted to make others disappear. The Hartwell house was built that year, spring of 1923, a 2-story Victorian with a wraparound porch, gabled roof, and ornate woodwork that must have cost a fortune. It appeared seemingly overnight. One day the lot was empty, the next the house stood complete, as if it had grown from the earth itself, rather than being built by human hands. No one remembered seeing construction crews, no lumber deliveries, no workmen coming and going. It was just there. According to the county records, yellowed, fragile documents stored in the basement of the municipal building, the house was registered to a couple named Victor and Eleanor Hartwell. The deed was dated May 15, 1923. But here's where the story fractures into something inexplicable. No one in Ashmore County remembered the Hartwells, not the elderly residents interviewed over the decades, not the historical society's archived oral histories, not the church records, school registries, or local newspaper archives. The Hartwells existed only on that single deed and the property tax ledger, taxes that were somehow paid in cash, delivered by mail with no return address, for exactly 37 years until the payment simply stopped in 1960. The postmarks came from different towns, different states, never the same place twice. Research into Victor and Eleanor Hartwell revealed nothing. No birth certificates, no military service records, no marriage license, no photographs, no census data. It was as if they'd been created on paper for the sole purpose of owning that house, then erased from existence everywhere else. The house stood, empty, untouched, watching. Locals knew to stay away. It became an unspoken rule, passed down through generations like a fairy tale that everyone half believed. Children dared each other to touch the gate. Teenagers told stories around campfires about screams heard from inside, about lights in the windows on moonless nights, about the smell of something rotting that seemed to emanate from the property even in winter. But no one ever went inside, not officially, not until the ground opened up. Patricia Morrison didn't believe in ghost stories. At 63, she'd been a real estate surveyor for Ashmore County for 28 years. She'd mapped every inch of this territory, walked every property line, documented every structure. She was practical, methodical, and utterly immune to superstition. When the county finally decided to seize the Hartwell property for unpaid taxes, a process that had taken decades of legal wrangling due to the unclear ownership, Patricia was the one they sent to conduct the official survey. She arrived at 8:47 a.m. on that gray November morning, her pickup truck splashing through puddles that looked more like small ponds. The rain had softened to a drizzle, but the air hung thick with moisture, making every breath feel like drowning. Patricia was a tall woman, angular and weathered, with steel gray hair she kept in a practical bun and hands calloused from years of outdoor work. She wore the same thing she always wore: work boots, canvas pants, a flannel shirt under a waterproof jacket, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. She carried her surveying equipment with the ease of long practice: theodolite, measuring tape, stakes, and a worn leather notebook she'd been filling for 3 decades. She'd passed the Hartwell house hundreds of times, had even stopped once or twice to look at it from the road. But she'd never walked the property. Never crossed that invisible line. Today, she had no choice. It was her job. The front gate had collapsed entirely, lying in pieces in the mud. Patricia stepped over it carefully, noting the rust patterns, the way the metal had corroded from the inside out. As she walked up the overgrown path toward the house, she noticed how quiet it was. Not even the sound of birds, just the soft patter of rain and her own footsteps squelching in the saturated earth. The house loomed ahead, gray paint peeling in long strips, windows dark and somehow deeper than they should be. The porch sagged in the middle. Vines had claimed the walls, covering whole sections in a tangled embrace that looked almost purposeful, as if the forest was trying to pull the structure back into itself. Patricia began her survey at the northeast corner of the property, working methodically, taking measurements, driving stakes. She'd planned to avoid the house itself. That would require a structural inspector. But she needed to map the entire lot, including the gardens. The gardens, that's where everything changed. The eastern side of the property held what had once been an elaborate garden. You could still see the ghost of it. The outline of raised beds, the collapsed remnants of a trellis, the stumps of what might have been rose bushes. 3 days of rain had transformed it into a muddy swamp. Patricia was taking measurements near what appeared to be the old garden center when her boot slipped. She caught herself, drove her stake into the ground for balance, and that's when she felt it give way. Not just soft earth, a collapse. The ground beneath her feet seemed to exhale, and suddenly she was falling, her stake plunging down through the mud into empty space below. Patricia threw herself backward, landing hard on her side, watching in horror as a section of earth roughly 6 feet wide simply sank inward with a wet, sucking sound. When the mud settled, there was a hole, and from that hole came a smell. Death has a scent that's unmistakable. It's not just decay, it's sweet and putrid and chemical all at once, a smell that seems to crawl into your nostrils and coat your throat. But this was different. This was old death. Ancient death. The smell of something that had been rotting for so long it had almost completed its journey back to earth. Almost. But not quite. Patricia scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering, and peered into the hole. The rain had washed away enough mud to reveal something that shouldn't exist, something that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Wooden boards, rotted, collapsing, but unmistakably boards arranged in a rectangular pattern. Not a natural formation, not roots or rocks. A box. A large box, buried in the garden, and through the gaps in the rotted wood, partially preserved by the acidic soil and the lack of oxygen in the sealed space, she could see fabric. Deteriorated, stained dark brown and black, but recognizable. Clothing. Human clothing. Patricia Morrison had seen many things in her career, but she'd never seen this. She backed away from the hole, pulled out her cell phone with shaking hands, and called the county sheriff. She tried to keep her voice steady as she reported what she'd found, tried to sound professional, but even she could hear the tremor when she said, "I think there's a body, maybe more than one, in the garden of the Hartwell house." What Patricia didn't tell the sheriff What she couldn't quite bring herself to say out loud was the other detail she'd noticed in those few terrible seconds of looking into that hole. The box wasn't just buried, it was locked from the outside. Heavy chains, green with corrosion, wrapped around the wooden structure, and through one gap in the boards, barely visible in the darkness, she'd seen something that made her stomach turn. Fingers. Skeletal fingers. Pressed against the inside of the wood, as if trying to claw their way out. By noon, the Hartwell property was swarming with vehicles. Sheriff's Department, State Police, the medical examiner's van. Yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the wind that had picked up as the rain finally stopped. Patricia sat in her truck, wrapped in the emergency blanket someone had given her, watching the organized chaos unfold. She'd given her statement 3 times now, each telling making the discovery feel less real and more like something from a nightmare. The forensics team worked carefully, excavating around the collapsed section. What they found made the lead investigator, a state police detective named Marcus Webb, call for additional resources. It wasn't one box, it was 2. 2 large wooden crates, buried side by side in the garden, each approximately 6.5 feet long. The rain had caused the earth above them to collapse, revealing what had been hidden for, based on the deterioration of the wood and the type of nails used, somewhere between 80 and 100 years. Detective Webb was a veteran with 23 years in homicide, most of it downstate in Philadelphia before he'd transferred to the quieter rural crimes of Ashmore County. He'd thought he'd seen everything. But standing in that garden, looking at those boxes, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine dread. The boxes were opened carefully, documented extensively, photographed from every angle. And what they contained matched the property records almost exactly. 2 bodies. Male and female, based on preliminary examination. Skeletal, with some tissue preservation due to the sealed environment. Clothing from the early 20th century. The man in a suit, the woman in a long dress. Both had been placed in the boxes with care, laid out straight, hands folded. Not dumped or discarded. Arranged. Like a burial. But the chains, the locks, those spoke of something darker. And there was more. As the forensic team excavated further, they found items buried with the bodies. A wedding ring on the woman's finger, a pocket watch in the man's jacket, and at the bottom of each box, preserved in the sealed environment, newspapers. The dates were visible, May 1923. The same month the house was built, the same month the deed was registered. By evening, the story had spread through Ashmore County like wildfire. The abandoned house, the buried bodies, the century-old mystery suddenly exposed by 3 days of rain. Detective Webb stood in the garden as the sun set, watching his team finish the excavation. The medical examiner had taken the remains, but preliminary findings were already deeply disturbing. Both victims showed signs of trauma, broken bones, defensive wounds on the hands. The woman's skull showed evidence of blunt force damage. The man's ribs were fractured in multiple places. They hadn't died peacefully. They'd died violently. And then someone, perhaps the same person who killed them, perhaps someone else, had dressed them carefully, placed them in boxes, locked those boxes with chains, and buried them in the garden of a brand new house. A house no one ever lived in. A house that stood empty for 100 years, watching over the graves of Victor and Eleanor Hartwell. Because that's what the forensic analysis would eventually confirm. The dental work, the bone structure, the age and sex of the victims all matched what records existed. The bodies in the boxes were indeed Victor and Eleanor Hartwell, the people who had supposedly owned this house, the people who had paid taxes on it for 37 years after their deaths. The people who, according to every official record, had never existed at all. Detective Webb looked up at the house, its dark windows reflecting the last light of day. In that moment, with the smell of disturbed earth and old death still in his nostrils, he understood something that the next investigation would confirm. This wasn't the end of the mystery. this was only the beginning. Because if Victor and Eleanor Hartwell were buried in the garden in 1923, who built this house? Who registered the deed? Who paid the taxes for nearly 4 decades? And most terrifying of all, what else was inside? The house stood silent, keeping its secrets. But as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and darkness fell over Ashmore County, Detective Marcus Webb made a decision. Tomorrow, they would go inside. Tomorrow, they would learn what the house had been hiding for 100 years. And in that moment, standing in that garden of the dead, Webb felt something he would never admit to anyone. The absolute certainty that some doors should never be opened. Some secrets should stay buried. But it was too late now. The rain had spoken. The earth had confessed. And the house was waiting. Dawn broke cold over Ashmore County on November 17, 2023. Detective Marcus Webb had barely slept, his mind churning through the impossible facts of the case. 2 bodies, a century-old murder, a house that existed without explanation. And somewhere in the dark hours before sunrise, he'd made a decision that felt less like police work and more like tempting fate. They would enter the Hartwell house at first light. The team assembled at 7:15 a.m. Webb had requested specialists, a structural engineer named David Park, whose job was to ensure they wouldn't die when the floor collapsed beneath them, a forensic archaeologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in historical crime scenes, and 2 state police officers, both young but experienced. Everyone wore protective gear, not just for safety, but because no one knew what they might find inside. Patricia Morrison stood by her truck, watching. She hadn't been asked to join, but she couldn't leave. Something about the house had gotten under her skin. In the gray morning light, it looked even more menacing, its windows like hollow eye sockets, the wraparound porch sagging like a broken smile. The front door was original, heavy oak with an ornate brass handle that had turned green with age. Webb approached it slowly, each step deliberate. Behind him, the team fanned out, cameras ready, flashlights cutting through the gloom of the porch. He reached for the handle. It was unlocked. The door swung open with a sound like a sigh, releasing a wave of stale air that smelled of dust, mildew, and something else. Something chemical and old. The smell of time itself, concentrated and trapped. David Park went in first, testing each floorboard, his equipment detecting structural integrity. "It's solid," he called back, surprise evident in his voice. "Shouldn't be, but it is. This wood should have rotted decades ago." They entered the house that had waited 100 years to be discovered. The interior defied all logic. A house abandoned for a century should be destroyed. Collapsed ceilings, rotted floors, walls claimed by mold and vegetation. But the Hartwell house was pristine. Not clean, but preserved, as if someone had sealed it in 1923 and simply walked away, leaving everything frozen in time. The entrance hall stretched before them, wallpaper peeling but still clinging to the walls in long strips that revealed the pattern beneath, dark roses on cream background. A grand staircase rose to the second floor, its banister intact, each spindle still standing. Dust covered everything in a thick blanket, undisturbed for decades, their footprints the first marks in an ocean of gray. But it was the furniture that stopped them cold. The house was fully furnished. Completely, meticulously furnished, as if the occupants had just stepped out for an afternoon walk. A coat rack by the door held a man's overcoat and a woman's shawl, both eaten by moths, but still recognizable. In the parlor to the left, a sofa and 2 chairs faced a fireplace, a coffee table between them still holding a tea service. Cups, saucer, teapot, all covered in dust, but arranged as if waiting for guests. "Doctor." Chen moved through the space with the careful attention of someone reading ancient text. She photographed everything, made notes in her recorder, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb whatever haunted this place. "The style is consistent with 1923, she said. "Early 20s. The furniture, the wallpaper, even the tea set. It's all period appropriate. But look at this. She pointed to the coffee table. There are only 2 cups, 2 saucers. Everything is set for exactly 2 people. Webb knelt beside the table, studying the arrangement. The teapot was bone china, delicate and expensive. The cups were positioned as if someone had been in the middle of pouring when they stopped. A thin brown residue stained the bottom of 1 cup. "Bag it," Webb ordered. "I want that analyzed." They moved deeper into the house. The dining room held a table set for 2. Plates, silverware, wine glasses, all covered in the same undisturbed dust. The kitchen was a time capsule, an old coal stove, copper pots hanging from hooks, a pump sink that probably drew from a well. On the counter, a knife and cutting board. Beside them, vegetables that had long since turned to dried husks. Everything suggested people had lived here. But the dust, the absolute absence of any disturbance, told a different story. This house had been staged, carefully, deliberately staged to look lived in, and then sealed, like a tomb. The second floor was where the atmosphere changed, where the performance of normalcy gave way to something darker. 3 bedrooms opened off the upstairs hallway. The first 2 were empty, bare walls, bare floors, windows that looked out onto the overgrown property. But the third bedroom, the master bedroom at the end of the hall, was different. The door was closed. Webb tested the handle. Locked. "Can you open it without destroying evidence?" he asked Park. The engineer examined the lock, old but simple. He produced his tools, worked for 2 minutes, and the lock clicked open. The smell hit them first. Not decay, but something medicinal. Camphor, maybe, or formaldehyde. The scent of preservation. The bedroom was immaculate. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, made with military precision. White sheets, a thick quilt, pillows arranged perfectly. On one side of the bed sat a nightstand with a photograph in a silver frame. On the other side, a matching nightstand with a leather-bound journal. Dr. Chen approached the photograph first, lifting it carefully. Through the dust-covered glass, a wedding portrait emerged. A man and woman, both in their 30s, dressed in formal clothing from the early 1920s. The man had sharp features, dark hair slicked back, eyes that seemed to follow you. The woman was beautiful, delicate features, light hair arranged in finger waves, a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Victor and Eleanor Hartwell," Webb said softly. "It has to be." But Dr. Chen was staring at something else. "Look at the background," she said, her voice tight. "Behind them." Webb leaned in. The photograph had been taken indoors, the couple posed before a wall. And on that wall, barely visible but unmistakable, was wallpaper with a distinctive pattern. Dark roses on cream background. "This photo was taken in this house," Dr. Chen whispered. "But that's impossible. They were killed when the house was built. They never lived here." Webb felt his skin crawl. He turned to the other nightstand, to the leather journal. It sat there like a coiled snake, waiting. He pulled on latex gloves and opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was elegant, feminine, flowing across the pages in dark ink that had survived the decades. The first entry was dated May 1st, 1923. "We arrived today at the house he built for us. It's beautiful. Everything I ever dreamed of. Victor says we'll be happy here. I want to believe him. I must believe him. There's no going back now." Webb flipped through the pages. May 2nd, May 3rd. Each entry shorter than the last, the handwriting becoming more erratic, the tone darker. May 8th. "The walls are too thick. No sound gets out. I've tried screaming. No one hears. Victor says it's for our protection." "From what?" May 10th. "I found the door to the basement yesterday. Victor forbids me to open it. He says there are things down there I shouldn't see. Things he left for us. What does that mean? Who is he?" May 12th. "I'm frightened. Victor isn't himself anymore. He stares at the walls like he can see through them. He talks to someone who isn't there. He calls him the architect. Says we owe him everything. Says we made a deal we can't break. May 14th. I tried to leave. The doors won't open. Not from the inside. We're locked in. God help us. We're locked in our own house. The final entry was dated May 15th, 1923. The handwriting was barely legible, shaking across the page like a scream frozen in ink. He came tonight. The architect. We heard him downstairs, walking through rooms we've never seen. Victor went down to face him. I heard shouting, breaking glass, Victor's screams. And then silence. Now he's coming up the stairs. I can hear his footsteps. Slow, patient, like he has all the time in the world. I'm writing this in case someone finds it. In case anyone ever knows, we didn't build this house. It built us. We were never supposed to live. We were always meant to be. The entry ended mid-sentence. A long ink smear across the page, as if the pen had been knocked from her hand. Webb stood in that bedroom, the journal trembling in his hands, and felt the weight of a century-old nightmare. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was impossible. Insane. "We need to find the basement," he said. They searched the first floor systematically. The kitchen, the pantry, the servants' quarters, all empty, all staged. No basement door, no stairs leading down. It wasn't until Officer Rodriguez noticed something odd about the hallway that they found it. The hallway was too short. By his measurements, there should be another 8 feet of space between the kitchen and the back wall, 8 feet that simply didn't exist in the floor plan. Park took out his tools and began tapping the walls, listening. The sound changed in one section, hollow instead of solid. He pressed, pushed, and suddenly, a section of wall swung inward, revealing a door that had been perfectly concealed by wallpaper and plaster. The door was metal, heavy, industrial, and it was covered in words. Someone had scratched into the metal surface with something sharp, carved desperately by someone who knew they were running out of time. The words overlapped, ran into each other, but the message was clear. Don't let him finish. The house feeds, the house grows. We were the first, but not the last. He's still building. Find the architect. Stop him before... The message ended there. The door was locked with multiple chains, padlocks that had rusted together. Park cut through them with a bolt cutter, each chain falling away with a metallic clang that echoed through the house. Webb pulled the door open. A staircase descended into absolute darkness. Stone steps, narrow and steep, leading down into a space that shouldn't exist. The smell that rose from below was overwhelming. Earth and chemicals and something else, something organic and wrong. Dr. Chen aimed her flashlight down. The beam disappeared into the darkness, unable to find the bottom. How deep does it go? Rodriguez asked. Too deep, Park said, checking his architectural plans. This shouldn't be here. According to the original survey, there's no basement. The foundation is slab. This, he gestured at the stairs. This is impossible. Webb started down. Each step felt wrong, as if the space itself was rejecting their presence. The temperature dropped with each descent, his breath misting in the flashlight beam. The walls were stone, hand-carved, wet with condensation that smelled faintly of copper. They descended for what felt like hours, but was probably only 3 minutes. When they finally reached the bottom, their flashlights revealed a space that made Webb's blood turn to ice. The basement was massive, far larger than the house above. Impossible. And it was a workshop. The space stretched out before them, supported by stone pillars that disappeared into the darkness above. Workbenches lined the walls, covered in tools, saws, hammers, chisels, all arranged with obsessive precision. Blueprints hung on boards, technical drawings of impossible complexity. But it wasn't the tools that froze them in place. It was what sat in the center of the room, a scale model, perfect in every detail, a miniature version of the Hartwell house, constructed with meticulous care from wood, metal, and glass. Every window, every door, every architectural detail replicated exactly. Except it wasn't just the Hartwell house. The model showed a much larger structure. The Hartwell house was only one section, one piece of something vast and sprawling. The model extended outward, showing wings and annexes and chambers that didn't exist in the real house above. Not yet. "It's a blueprint," Dr. Chen whispered. "The Hartwell house isn't complete. It was never supposed to stop at what we see. This," she gestured at the model, "this is what it was meant to become." Webb walked around the model, studying it. His flashlight caught something else, small details that made his stomach turn. In the miniature garden, 2 tiny boxes. In the walls of the house, small sealed spaces. In the foundation, chambers. And in each space, tiny carved figures. People. The model showed where people were buried. Not just Victor and Eleanor. Dozens of them. Maybe more. "Oh God," Rodriguez breathed. "It's a map. A map of all the bodies." Webb found a journal on one of the workbenches. Different from Eleanor's, this one was technical, precise, filled with architectural drawings and calculations. And notes. Always notes in a handwriting that was beautiful and terrible, flowing across pages in perfect script. "The house is a living thing," one entry read. "It must be fed. Blood and bone in the foundation. Life sacrificed to give it life." Victor and Eleanor were the first, the keystones. Their deaths consecrated the ground. But they are only the beginning. Another entry, dated 1927. "The house watches over them, keeps them close. I pay the taxes, maintain the illusion of ownership, but the truth is simple. They own nothing. The house owns them, as it owns me, as it will own all who come after." The final entry was dated March 1960. "I am old now, 73. The house is patient, but my time is ending. I will make one last payment, and then I will rest. I will join them in the garden, another cornerstone for what is to come. Future builders will find this place. They will understand. The house must grow. The architect's work must continue. Find the next. Make them understand. Blood and bone. Always blood and bone." The entry was signed, Jonathan Crane, the architect, November 20th, 2023. 3 days after discovering the basement, Ashmore County had transformed into a crime scene unlike anything in American history. State police, FBI, forensic anthropology teams from 3 universities, ground-penetrating radar equipment that cost more than most houses, because the model had been right. Terribly, impossibly right. The radar had found them all, 17 anomalies in the ground around the Hartwell house. 17 locations that matched the tiny carved figures in the architect's model. 17 graves, each containing a wooden box. Each box containing a body. Webb stood in what had once been the front lawn, now transformed into an archaeological dig site, and watched the teams work with methodical precision. Each grave was excavated carefully, documented, photographed. And with each discovery, the picture became clearer and more horrifying. The victims spanned decades. The oldest remains dated to 1923, Victor and Eleanor. The newest to 1959. 19 bodies in total, including the Hartwells. Men, women, ranging in age from early 20s to late 60s. All showed signs of violent trauma. All had been carefully arranged in boxes, locked and buried with the same ritualistic precision. But it was the pattern that revealed the truth. The thing that made Webb understand the true horror of what Jonathan Crane had done. The bodies weren't random. They were couples. 9 married couples, plus 1. Jonathan Crane himself, found in the 19th grave, buried beside an empty box that bore a woman's name, Margaret Crane, beloved wife, 1887 to 1922. Dr. Chen had spent 72 hours cross-referencing missing persons reports, census data, and historical records. What she discovered painted a picture of a serial killer unlike anything in the archives. Jonathan Crane was a master carpenter, she explained to Webb and the assembled investigators in the command tent. Born 1887 in Boston, moved to Ashmore County in 1920, 3 years after returning from the Great War. He'd served in the Army Corps of Engineers, building fortifications in France. That's where he developed his skills. She pulled up photographs on her laptop. A young man in uniform, handsome in a severe way, standing beside structures of his own design. His wife, Margaret, died in 1922, tuberculosis. By all accounts, he went into a deep depression, stopped taking carpentry jobs, isolated himself. And then, in early 1923, he suddenly had money again, lots of it. He bought this land, acquired building materials, and began construction on the Hartwell house. Where did the money come from? Webb asked. That's the thing. We don't know. There's no record of any inheritance, no insurance payout, no sale of property. The money just appeared. But what we do know is who Victor and Eleanor Hartwell really were. Dr. Chen pulled up another document. Their real names were Victor and Eleanor Ashford, from Philadelphia, married in 1920. They disappeared in April 1923 after answering a newspaper advertisement for exclusive housing opportunity in rural Pennsylvania. Webb felt his stomach drop. An advertisement. Yes. And we found more. 8 other couples who disappeared between 1923 and 1959, all from different cities, all after responding to similar advertisements. Always offering the same thing. A beautiful house in the country, affordable rates, privacy guaranteed. The picture was complete now. Jonathan Crane had lured couples to Ashmore County with promises of affordable housing. They would arrive excited, hopeful, dreaming of new lives. And Crane would show them the house, the beautiful Victorian he'd built with his own hands. But the house had a secret. The locks only worked from the outside. Once inside, you couldn't leave. The walls were thick, soundproofed with techniques Crane had learned in the war. The windows didn't open. The house was a cage dressed as a dream. And in that cage, Crane would trap them, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, letting them realize slowly that they'd been tricked, that no one knew where they were, that no one was coming. The journals found in the basement detailed it all with the precision of a craftsman documenting his work. How long each couple survived, what they said, how they begged. Crane recorded everything with cold, clinical detail, as if he were conducting an experiment. Why? Webb asked. Why did he do it? Dr. Chen's expression was grim. The journals suggest he was trying to replicate something. The trauma of losing his wife had broken something in his mind. He became obsessed with the idea that death gave meaning to buildings, that structures needed sacrifice to become alive. He called it blood architecture. She showed Webb a passage from one of Crane's journals. Margaret died in a hospital, sterile, meaningless, a building of sickness and death but no purpose. I will build differently. Each death will mean something, will be part of something greater. The house will be their monument, their eternal home, blood and bone in the foundation, life given freely, or taken, to create something permanent. He was insane, Webb said. Yes, but methodical, brilliant in his way. He was never caught because he was patient. He only took one couple every few years, always from different cities, always transients who wouldn't be immediately missed. He registered the house under their names, used their identities to maintain the fiction. And when they died, he buried them in the garden they'd never got to enjoy and moved on to the next. But there was something that didn't fit, a detail that nagged at Webb as he reviewed the evidence. The grave sites formed a pattern around the house, a specific geometric arrangement that had meaning in Crane's twisted logic. 8 graves created an octagon around the perimeter, Victor and Eleanor at the corners, Jonathan Crane himself at what would be the entrance to a larger structure. But there were 19 bodies, and only 18 graves. The ground-penetrating radar had found one more anomaly, not in the garden, inside the house itself. Beneath the basement floor, deeper than should be possible, the radar had detected a void, a space that the architectural plans didn't show. A chamber that Jonathan Crane's model had marked with a single carved figure, larger than all the others. The Mother Stone, his journal called it. The first sacrifice. The one that began everything. They broke through the basement floor on November 22nd. 3 feet of concrete, then stone, then more concrete. Crane had sealed it like a pharaoh's tomb, meant never to be opened. When they finally broke through, the smell that rose from below was different from the others. Not just old death. Something else. Something preserved. Webb descended into the chamber with Dr. Chen, their flashlights cutting through darkness that felt solid. The space was small, maybe 8 feet square, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house. And in the center, on a raised stone platform, was a glass coffin. Victorian era. Expensive. The kind used for viewing bodies before burial, and inside, perfectly preserved by the sealed environment and something else. Chemicals Crane had used, formulas he'd perfected in his basement laboratory, was the body of a woman, Margaret Crane, his wife. She lay in a wedding dress, hands folded over a bouquet of dried roses. Her features were intact, skin like yellowed parchment stretched over bone, but recognizable from the photograph they'd found. She looked peaceful, serene. But it was what surrounded the coffin that made Webb's blood freeze. Candles. Hundreds of them, melted into organic shapes that flowed around the platform like frozen wax rivers. Photographs covered every inch of the walls, Margaret in life, smiling, young, vibrant. And between the photographs, carved into the stone with obsessive precision, were words. The same phrase, repeated thousands of times until it covered every surface. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. He built the house on top of her, Dr. Chen whispered. Everything, the murders, the burials, the entire nightmare, it was all built on the foundation of his dead wife. They found his final journal beside the coffin. The last entry was dated March 15, 1960, written in a hand that shook with age or madness or both. I am 73 years old. I have built and killed for 37 years, 19 couples, 38 souls to keep Margaret company, to make her monument something worthy. But I see now that it was never enough, will never be enough. The house needs more, always more. It hungers. I thought I was the architect. I thought I was building something meaningful from grief, but I was wrong. The house was always in control. It began the moment I sealed Margaret beneath the foundation. It fed on my grief, my guilt, my madness. It shaped me into its instrument. I am old, tired. The house whispers now, day and night, demanding more. But I have no more to give. So I will give myself. I will make the final payment. I will join the others in the garden, and perhaps then Margaret will forgive me. Perhaps then the house will sleep. But I fear it won't. I fear this is only the beginning. That future hands will find this place and continue what I started. That the house will find new architects to feed its hunger. If you're reading this, you've found them all. The bodies, the basement, Margaret. You know what I did, what the house made me do. I only ask one thing. Burn it. Burn it all. Don't let it spread. Don't let it grow. The model shows what it wants to become. Destroy it before it's too late. The entry ended there. Jonathan Crane had climbed out of the basement, walked into the garden, and shot himself in the head. A groundskeeper had found him 3 days later, and not knowing the truth, buried him quietly in an unmarked grave on the property. Just another forgotten body in Ashmore County. The house had stood empty after that, waiting, watching, dreaming of what it could become. December 1st, 2023. The decision had been made at the highest levels. The Hartwell house would be destroyed. Not just demolished, but systematically dismantled, every piece documented and disposed of separately. The bodies had been exhumed, given proper burials in a county cemetery far from this cursed ground. Margaret Crane had been cremated per her family's wishes, her ashes scattered in Boston Harbor where she'd been born. Webb stood at the property line as the demolition crew prepared for the final phase. They'd taken the house apart piece by piece, the furniture, the fixtures, the walls, the floors, every board examined, every nail catalogued, and in the process, they'd found more of Crane's madness. Messages carved into the structural beams, hidden behind walls. Personal items from the victims sealed into the insulation. Photographs embedded in the foundation. The house had been built as a monument to Crane's obsession, every inch of it screaming with silent trauma. But it was the model they'd found in the basement that haunted Webb's dreams. The vast structure Crane had imagined, spreading out from the original house like a cancer. Wings and annexes and chambers, each marked with spaces for bodies. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The house hadn't been a home. It had been the seed of something much worse. And if Crane had lived longer, if he'd found others to continue his work, that seed might have grown into something genuinely monstrous. The demolition foreman gave the signal. The remaining structure, just the basement and foundation now, would be filled with concrete, sealed forever. The property would be donated to the State Forest Service, marked as unsuitable for development, allowed to return to the wilderness that had tried to reclaim it for a century. As the concrete trucks began their work, Webb thought about Jonathan Crane. A man broken by grief, a talented craftsman twisted by trauma into something monstrous. He'd built his grief into the very bones of the house, and that grief had become hungry, demanding, a living thing that fed on death. In the end, that's what the Hartwell house had been. Not just a crime scene or a monument to madness. It had been grief made manifest. Grief that demanded company. Grief that refused to end. 3 months later, Webb received a package at the state police headquarters. No return address. Postmarked from a small town in Oregon. Inside was a photograph. Old, sepia-toned, showing a young couple standing before a newly built house. Victorian style, wraparound porch, gabled roof. The couple smiled at the camera, hopeful and excited. On the back, written in fading ink, the Thompson House, Eugene, Oregon, built 1924. Webb felt his blood turn cold. He immediately contacted the Eugene Police Department, requested they check the property. 3 days later, they called him back. The house had been abandoned for 99 years. No record of who built it or who owned it. Tax payments had come by mail until 1961, then stopped. The property was scheduled for seizure and survey next month. Webb told them everything, told them to bring ground-penetrating radar, told them to expect the worst. They found the first body a week later. And as Webb hung up the phone, staring at the photograph of that innocent couple who disappeared a century ago, he understood something that Jonathan Crane's final journal had tried to warn about. He hadn't been the architect. He'd been the first apprentice. Somewhere, whoever had taught Crane the secret of blood architecture had continued their work, had built more houses, sealed more grief into foundations, created more monuments to madness. And those houses were still standing, still waiting, still hungry. The Hartwell house was gone, reduced to rubble and concrete and memory, but it had never been alone. It had brothers and sisters scattered across America, hidden in plain sight, patient and hungry and eternal. Webb opened his desk drawer and pulled out the file he'd started. Houses like the Hartwell, properties with suspicious histories, structures that stood empty for decades, places where couples disappeared without explanation. He'd found 12 so far, and he was just beginning to search. The rain started again outside his window, drumming against the glass like fingers tapping, 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 waiting for someone to answer, waiting for someone to come inside. Because houses like these never really die. They just wait. And time is something they have in abundance. The end. Some structures are built to shelter us. Others are built to consume us. The difference isn't always clear until the door closes behind you. Touch from the Journal of Detective Marcus Webb, December 2023.